Welcome to the RN Cosmos studio, where we have the opportunity to interview Nicolas Dachotko once again. Hello, Xavier. We're going to talk today about arms exports. France is great in the field.
France is strong and could be even much better. Yes, well, the countries that buy weapons, in general, you need to have a good reason to buy weapons. And it's a bit like an insurance policy. So to look a bit at the potential for French exports in the coming years, I think the first thing to try to understand is why people arm themselves. Why do people arm themselves? And what is happening today? The geopolitical situation is known, but I think if we look at several years, it's maybe not bad to start by looking at the major risk that could happen and go back to see why people are going to arm themselves for that risk. So what is the major risk today with the war in Ukraine, which is, let's say, decreasing in intensity? At a time when we are potentially talking about stopping, there we hope for a ceasefire, the biggest risk in the world. It would be a confrontation between China and Taiwan, and then Taiwan, aided by the United States. There we would have a major conflict between the first world power, the United States, and the second world power, China. That's called a world war. We've already experienced in the past. What world wars lead to? Well, we don't have very good memories of it. Well, right now we're not at all, let's say, at the center of the conflict, unlike the last time where for once we were really on the front line But it could be interesting to explore a credible scenario of what would happen. And well, the effect is that China is arming itself quite rapidly with very modern technologies. And that's what's upsetting the balance of power that has existed until now. And
This explains the rise in tension and significant arms sales or purchases on all the countries that surround China, since it has conflicts with all of them. Exactly.
But not only that, this also explains why the United States is going to give a boost, and it explains why everyone is going to rearm in the coming years. So is China capable, or would it be in its interest to invade Taiwan today? The first thing is, why do they want to invade Taiwan? It's a well-known story. They can do it. Well, they can try to do it at any time. And I think we need to take it seriously, especially now that they're starting to have a Navy and an Air Force to do it. So I think today it's premature because, in fact, they particularly need fifth-generation aircraft, and they're fifth-generation aircraft. Today, it's the J-20 that made its first flight in 2017. Well, first flight in 2011, arrived in the forces in 2017. Today, in open source, if I understand correctly, they would have about 300 operational. The worst part is that they plan to build 120 next year, indicating an extremely fast construction pace. That's 10 per month. The Rafale, we try to go up to
3 for...
See a bit the rates. And across the Americans who would fight against the J-20, it would be the F-35, and we are on rates. Lockheed Martin, we expect them to make 150 next year, or about 14 per month. So that means that today, in fifth-generation fighters, the Americans, they have roughly 200 aging F-22s, with the last ones produced in 2012, but still highly capable aircraft. They have produced a little over 1,000 F-35s, and there they are at 150 per year. So if we project to 2035, there will be 1,500 more. So let's say between 2,500 and 3,000 fifth-generation planes. And on the other hand, the Chinese, who have 300 today, then 120 times 10, assuming they don't increase. So at a rhythm of 1,500, we begin to have something functional. Asymptotically, I can advocate for myself.
Of the devil. The J-20 claims to be a fifth-generation aircraft, but we know they don't have the radars, especially with correct waveforms on the electronic scanning radar. We know that even if they display a fifth-generation aircraft, it is not as stealthy or of the same quality. The statement is incomplete.
It's better than the F-35, but I don't like it.
I don't like the F-35.
Quite surely, but it is clearly below. It is bigger. It can be seen from a little further away, but it remains a fifth-generation aircraft that would generate losses against the F-35. When I look at simulations, I've looked at quite a few, which are open-source simulations. These are war games, and people engage in them on platforms like DCS, though there are certainly mistakes in the simulations. By the way, it's very good because I don't work with any data.
Confidential.
I'm piecing together the puzzle using open source data. From what I can tell, the F-35 appears to have superior stealth capabilities. So it manages to get detected in open source. It's 15 to 20 nautical miles, and there it can fire, and it will not be detected until 15 to 20 nautical miles. The J-20, always in open source, ranges from 30 to 40 nautical miles. So in fact, the F-35 arrives, fires first, but it has a limited number of ammunition. If there is an excess, like 25 J-20 against 5 F-35, the F-35s will get caught because they fire first, but then they keep moving forward. There they enter the area where infrared detects them. They get shot at and shot down. While it may be slightly inferior, it still greatly surpasses all fourth-generation fighters. However,
modern systems such as IRCs eliminate the need for radars, contrary to what we discussed in the past. The system on the Rafale has a visibility of 40 kilometers. We can identify and lock onto a target to shoot at 40 kilometers. That's why radar and stealth is not the only quality of an aircraft. Okay.
But from where I stand, what I see is that the F-35 clearly has an advantage. However, there is a question of power balance and numbers.
That is to say that
twice as many J-20s will cause absolutely enormous losses on the F-35. Since the Americans have planes on various fronts, they would need to urgently repatriate them. So that's a good question, because precisely from the incoming administration, the strategic thinker for me of the new administration is Elbridge Colby, who will be Under Secretary of State for Defense. For policy, basically, he's going to be the chief planner. And he has a vision that says China is a heavyweight boxer. We are a heavyweight boxer. They can call us for a match at any time, and at their place, they play at home. So as a result, our strategy must consist of gathering all our resources and all our resources, including those in Europe, in order to win this match. And in fact, he draws a parallel between the Second World War and this potential World War, saying that during the Second World War, the main theater was Europe. That's where we couldn't afford to lose. And Japan, the Pacific, was a secondary theater. At that time, they were able to fight on both theaters. He says, if we can't fight on both theaters simultaneously, we must prioritize the main one. The Indo-Pacific is their primary theater. In a confrontation, they will rapidly employ all available means, all means including those in Europe, that can be useful to them. Obviously, a tank in Bramble will not be useful in Taiwan, but a Patriot battery, that can be useful in Taiwan. So the F-35s, everything we call the effectors, finally the large refueling planes, cargo planes, etc., etc. The question could also potentially arise for us. I'm not considering Eastern European countries, which will focus on Russia, but rather Western European countries. I'm thinking of Great Britain, France, potentially a bit of Germany. We can also ask ourselves, in a conflict, what would our options be and how would we respond? And would we send resources there knowing that we have resources to send? I'm thinking of the Rafales, I'm thinking of the 1,000 multi-role tanker transport, I'm thinking of the 400 1000, I'm thinking of the Sante batteries, the Asta. We have quite a bit of strategic equipment that could be useful, knowing.
The Air Force has validated exercises where about 20 gusts of memory were deployed in less than 2 days towards Polynesia.
A relay in case of conflict in the area. Even in the Pegasus exercise in summer 2023, there were 10 Rafales, 5 MRTTs, and 4 400Ms. So unlike the Navy, the problem with the Navy is that the carrier group, if it's not already in place when there's a conflict, it will arrive too late. In fact, there would be a few-week battle for air supremacy over Taiwan. In fact, there are 3 possibilities or options. Either China obtains air supremacy over Taiwan, and there, I think Taiwan will be conquered. Either the US Air Force and the US Navy have air supremacy over Taiwan, and there, at that moment, the island will be saved. Either it's a bit like in Ukraine, no one manages to have air supremacy, and there we'll see. I think there would rather be an advantage to the defenders, but therefore it's absolutely essential to have air supremacy over the island. And the Chinese are playing at home since they are 180 kilometers away, and the US Navy has a big problem. It's that it has some bases. It has Kadena in Okinawa, which is the big base, but it's a bit of a lightning rod. It's going to draw the lightning. The Chinese have ballistic missiles, and in fact, the advantage of ballistic missiles is that they will use them to destroy large strategic assets. That is to say, the planes on the ground, to put it simply, potentially aircraft carriers, boats. They have an air force that is ramping up, and then a navy that is ramping up at a frantic pace. And everything is done to be able to confront the American army. So,
if we go back to the basic question, the Americans need to arm themselves more, and all the countries in the area, there you go.
The Americans need to arm themselves more. And above all, you're going to have a police, an American policy, particularly under the Trump administration, but I think he will be prosecuted later, of resource recovery. They will keep for themselves all the resources they can have. The F-35 is a collaborative program between the US and its allies. Roughly speaking, they sold 25% of the F-35 to their allies. They kept 75%. We should expect there to be tensions for them to keep the maximum number of F-35. to maintain numerical superiority in case of conflict, which impacts all the others, well, what are the other options? And in fact, the other options ultimately are either the Eurofighter or the Rafale as the most modern aircraft. The effect.
The domino effect of this strategic vision several decades from the escalation in Taiwan is that Europe would be naked. One, because the Americans are leaving, but in addition, they no longer want to potentially provide us with the weapons we are trying to buy from them. Yes.
Finally, resources will be attracted like a magnet attracts iron towards the main theater, which would be the Pacific. And so and I would even say we will have to arbitrate, because how do we help the Americans at that time? The question arises. Because if we go back to the power relations I was talking about, we can imagine the Americans in 2035, that they have between 2,500 and 3,000 fifth generation aircraft. Presumably the installed base of Gusts at that time. Today, there are 300 Gusts that have been produced. When it comes to French and other armies, the installed base is what matters. As we saw with Ukraine, this becomes crucial in times of war. We can negotiate with the countries that have bought them. We buy back the houses and promise to build more for them. Eventually, there will likely be a big market for these houses. Between 500 and 600 Gusts that will have been built, we will have to see the state of modernization of each Gust, but it's not nothing. 500
Gusts. If
tomorrow we go to Washington and tell them that in case of conflict, we can potentially mobilize for you. 500 Gusts, it's then, okay, it's generation 4.5, but finally it still shoots Meteor. It's not completely useless, especially since, as I was saying, the numerical balance of power is extremely important. There you go, but that's not all. There are also the tankers, for example. So then, just on the
Rafale. First point, because of Asia, the Rafale is a plane that, yes, has an interesting perspective. Already, with all the orders that are today, but which are expected to grow even more. My
opinion is that it's the plane of choice for the countries of the second curtain. The first curtain countries, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and the US. The American F-35 system will be on the front line for them. However, the Americans will tell all the countries of the second curtain not to pump their
resources.
If you buy something else, you manufacture something else.
Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, all these countries.
They're all bought elsewhere, and everyone buys something else. And there are two choices. It's Eurofighter or Rafale, and I believe the match is pretty much settled between the two. It's the Rafale that stands out. So we should expect there to be orders for Rafale. I even think that we could also have orders for Rafale in Europe, if we know them well.
Sell, because
we have things to sell, so the Rafale, it goes well with the F-35. Greece has it well.
Understood, that's it.
Greece understood it well. One could argue that Gusts could interest Poland and even Germany. There's something else we could play. It's the nuclear card. That is, if we find ourselves in a situation where the Americans are preoccupied in the Indo-Pacific, we need to be able to keep the Russians in check. So we have two problems. We have the problem of keeping them in check. In terms of nuclear, we have fewer heads than today. France and England then, which are the two nuclear powers of the continent of the zone. Let's say we have about 600 nuclear heads, and that's what the Russians have on their submarines. They have contributed more than $5,000 or $6,000, which is enough to shave.
There you go.
It's enough to shave. But in both cases, Putin is counting the accounts that when he negotiates. And so we still have something exceptional. It's the SMPA. We could imagine sharing the SMPA with Eastern countries, for example, with dual key systems. To get the SMPA, you must have the Rafale. So that means if you buy the Rafale, you the Baltic countries, you Romania, you tomorrow, Ukraine, potentially you have a plane that can carry a SMPA. It doesn't mean we're going to give you a SMPA, but it means that in a context of escalating tension, if ever the other side does not respect international laws at that time, maybe we too will start not respecting them.
The framework could include countries currently equipped with American weapons, which I find diplomatically ambitious. In Europe, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Turkey could potentially, with the Rafale, be with another nuclear system. It would always be under double lock. They buy from us, finance our nuclear capacity, and buy our fighter planes. And possibly, in case of war, there is still the French president who has the double key. And
I think that's it.
I find it hard to imagine the Germans agreeing to be under the orders of Macron when they wouldn't agree to be under Donald Trump's orders.
Why not in the context of evolution? Yes, but there could be both options in this case. We could offer a second option to Germany, and then we could outright offer an option to the Eastern countries. Knowing that I am not a specialist in international treaties, I know it's a bit
sensitive.
very sensitive. But in any case, we can tell them if you have gusts, and if it goes wrong, a gust, it can fire an ASMPA after. If we need to build more ASMPAs, because we don't have many ASMPAs, but we could imagine building a lot more, I think that if we want to negotiate with Russia, we should have 1,000. The problem also is that the SMP in French, it's not quite the same as an SMP in Baltic or Polish. Because Putin, he knows that we will only fire the SMP at when our vital interests will be threatened. And an offensive on Riga, for example, are our vital interests threatened. The situation in France during de Gaulle's time was unclear. This is why de Gaulle wanted to strengthen France. He thought that the Americans would not shoot at the Soviets just if France is invaded. And so we could finesse a bit, I think. And in any case, if you want to potentially have this option, you would need to throw in some Rafale. Go on.
Rafale numbers are set to increase. Submarines, the second strategic asset, are also rising significantly in skill and capacity. It's the submarines, yes.
France is strong in submarines, we are strong in submarines, we are strong in conventional submarines, and then there was the story of the Australian submarines. When I look at the file, I am absolutely convinced that in the end they will order nuclear submarines from us. That is to say, the Australia, United Kingdom, United States deal, I think it won't go through with the Trump administration. So what happened? The Australians, seeing the Chinese threat, seeing the Chinese Navy increase, thought they needed submarines to potentially intercept a naval group that would come to bomb the Australian coast. At that time, they signed a contract with Naval Group for, from memory, 12 submarines, which was actually a modification of our nuclear submarine Safraint. We were changing two things: converting the nuclear propulsion to conventional and replacing the French combat system with the American one. In 2021, the Australian government declares that conventional submarines are insufficient. What we need are nuclear ones. They then made this deal behind our backs with the Americans and the English. And everything, it's not very clear, but in any case, what I understand is that the United States committed to providing them with submarines. Virginia, who is their
latest born.
Today, there are 24 Virginia submarines operating in the US Navy, a program that began in 2011. Until recently, they made 2 per year. Last year, production fell to 1.3, indicating a pace problem. And Colby, he's already made it very clear. The problem with this deal at Q is that everything is submarine. Virginia, which we give to Australia, a second-tier country, is still very far from Taiwan. Even if they are in the Pacific, it's fewer Virginias. For the US Navy, these are strategic assets. I don't want to give you my nuclear submarines, and so I think they won't get the Virginia part. So there remains the second part, which was, if I understand correctly, 7 submarines to be made with the English. But there, we are completely outside the window. In terms of time, we are in 2045. And so what remains for them if they want nuclear submarines quickly enough for a conflict, 2035, 2045? They have 2 choices: either buy English astute submarines from the first 2010 series, with the last one being delivered, or buy Suffren-class submarines. Assuming we are ready to sell them, because that is still a decision of the President of the Republic, let's start from the
principle that all the
world agrees. There you go. But let's start from the principle that it's possible. What is the advantage of the Suffren? 1, he's 10 years younger, and then 2, we can release them faster than the Astutes. While they took 3 to 4 years, we, the Suffrens, did it every 2 years. We finished the series at the end of the decade, and in fact, we would just need to continue producing with the line during the years. 2030, 2040, and we can release them. We can even speed up the pace. We could release 1 every 2 years. I think we are capable of that, and see 1 per year. So I'm told that there are nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines coming up behind. Investments may be needed, possibly a second line, if not in Cherbourg due to lack of space, then maybe elsewhere. Adaptation might be necessary. We will find ways if a real war occurs, yes. And in the end, what we can offer them is a submarine that is designed, that works. But in my opinion, we must inform them that we are not making further changes and that we are implementing them in France. That is to say, all the negotiations we had done on the last contract, which consisted of skills transfer, this, that, it's a perfect recipe to explode the costs. In my opinion, the threat is serious enough that we should not change anything. We make carbon copies and then we will do the maintenance there, but that's it. So
we will also remind that outside of this area of Australia, the French submarines. We have, for example, the
Netherlands who have bought, we
have Romania, many countries that buy Scorpin, but also
versions.
non-nuclear submarines. The
So, for instance, yes,
We possess unique, unrivaled skills and capabilities. While there are other proposals globally, they don't match our quality. And for example, we can think of medium-change missiles. Only France offers for export a missile that is capable of changing medium from a submarine to hit a helicopter or a ship. That does not exist. So
the Americans know how to do it, but they don't export it. There are things they don't export. Yes, so we have a certain number of strategic platforms to offer to many countries for ourselves. In my view, one final item we need to prepare is ammunition, as we observed in Ukraine that a high-intensity war rapidly demands it. And there, if you want to sell your platforms, it's better if you have large boxes of ammunition to offer to go with it. And there, for the record, for me, the designated actor, for missiles, well, asterisks, anti-aircraft missiles, meteors, scalps, the scalps, we would need to produce boxes of them. In my view, Europe should address the current situation as it's not unfolding as it should. I think with a budget of 10 billion a year, we could already have extremely large quantities of ammunition. What if there are tensions or a conflict in the Asia-Pacific tomorrow? If we have large quantities of ammunition, if we are sitting on large quantities of ammunition, it's not at all the same diplomatic weight, because it means that we can really shift the balance of power in case of conflict. And then, in fact, the whole problem we had with artillery in Ukraine in a conflict with China, United States, and be careful, because this conflict could spread to Europe later, because what could happen is that the Chinese attack Taiwan, they succeed or they don't. The result will be roughly the same. So not for the Taiwanese, but for the balance of power in the world. That is to say, you will have Taiwan, which will have been raised. But there is no scenario where China is invaded by the United States because it is a nuclear power. And also no scenario where China goes far beyond its coastal region. That's not possible. They don't have the logistics to do that. So we end up with a conflict similar to Germany and England in 1940 after the Battle of Britain. And then what did Hitler do? He went to attack the Soviet Union thinking, I will defeat the Soviet Union and that will force England to negotiate peace. We could have China saying we're going to restart the war in Eastern Europe, but this time we, the Chinese, are going to fully support the Russians. This differs greatly from the current situation in Ukraine. They have resources, they have an industrial system that is much more powerful, so it's much more threatening. And there we need to be able to hold them in check. So we need to have ammunition for ourselves and possibly also to come and lend a hand to our allies in the Pacific if possible. So
even the conflict on the other side of the world must impose a massive rearmament for Europe. So export to Europe already in the first place to protect ourselves.
Yes, of course. When we say today, let's imagine there's a ceasefire in Ukraine. We know that the Russians are not happy with what they got. We know it's a frozen conflict after all, and so it can start again at any moment. If we have a world war, the characteristic of a world war is that it happens everywhere in the world, and therefore it generates conflicts all over the world. And the second theater after the Pacific would obviously be Europe. And in my opinion, the most sensitive place is the Netherlands, because there is no strategic depth. So we need to have the means to keep the Russians at bay, but that's not the hardest part. They have the Sukhoi 35 and Sukhoi 57, but we have the far superior Rafale. But we have to imagine the Chinese army, because all their land resources pass through the Trans-Siberian, and who, like the North Koreans at Kursk today, come and attack the Baltic countries with the Russians. While it doesn't seem credible in the near future, it appears to be a quite possible scenario in the next 10 to 20 years. The situation is drastically different there, particularly without the Americans present, since their resources are focused elsewhere.
We're not talking about the Middle East, the
Middle East, one could imagine, because in fact the allies, the coalition, I don't know what we would call them, but you would have China, Russia, North Korea, and then Iran. We can imagine a third theater in the Middle East. What would likely happen? If there was a conflict between the Chinese and the Americans, you would probably have a maritime blockade of China. Similar to the maritime blockade we imposed on Germany in World War I, or the sanctions on Russia.
today, or
The sanctions on Russia today do not impose a maritime blockade. However, I believe that in this case it would be a genuine maritime blockade. Well, what does that mean? The Chinese today are very, very dependent on raw materials for their oil imports. They are 70% dependent on iron ore, 80% dependent, and also dependent on agri-food. The Russians, that's why it's very complementary, in fact, Russia and China. Because Russia can provide a lot of raw materials that China needs, and China has the industrial tool that Russia does not have. But so, As a result, what they could do, if we impose a blockade, is to come and attack the oil supply flows in the Middle East. And there they could block the Strait of Hormuz, attack the Saudi oil fields of Kuwait, the Emirates, and coincidentally, these people are buying gusts. It's just that, well, they understood that there was a threat. Finally, we have known for a long time that there is a threat, but the threat from Iran, that's one thing, it's serious. And the threat from China, which would come to close, that would be something very serious. Yes, there could potentially be a third conflict zone in the Middle East. And so those people too, all the people in the Indian Ocean, India, I don't think there's really a risk of a serious conflict between India and China on the Sino-Indian border, because it's completely useless. But on the other hand, if there's a closure of the Strait of Hormuz or an attack on the oil fields of the Middle East, India, they are on the front lines. Hence,
Saudi Arabia is considering Eurofighters and even Rafales. All these countries are rearming, with India set to purchase over 100 Rafale fighter jets. Turkey faces a conflict between its Navy and Air Force due to their incomplete historical programs. But we talk a lot about very strategic systems, very top of the line, the multi-role tanker transport, etc. We don't talk too much about land, by the way, because ultimately this export volume may not be the highest there. But do we also have chances in this field competing with other countries? I'm especially thinking of Germany for tanks. So,
for tanks with Germany, I think Germany has established itself as the leader in tanks. But on the other hand, the Caesar, I think the Caesar there, that's it. We have reached quite significant production rates. I think we're going to mass produce them. And that, for once, it's quite conceivable. By 2035 to 2040, there could be 1,500 Caesars on the eastern flank. Then there's Jaguar, finally the Scorpion. The whole Scorpion corner. It's a bit of a shame that we couldn't test it in Ukraine. I think commercially it would have been really good, but it exists. There aren't many Ukrainians to save, but that's a separate discussion. Also, no. But I think it can be used to equip. But for the tanks themselves there, I think that either we manage to agree with the Germans, but it will be the Germans who will be leaders. Like us, we will be leaders. On the Rafale and artillery, I think it's a state matter. Yes, okay.
So I summarized the Rafale, we're killing it. The naval, we're killing it. And there
you go, especially the submarines, because there is more competition. We have very, very good frigates. The FDI,
good, but
I think we would be better able to sell them if we had ammunition stocks, especially Aster, much more than Aster, well, the naval missile, etc., etc. That is the country that buys the boat. It needs to know that it will be able to be resupplied, that we have a flow of ammunition to provide it. And that, I think, for now, is one of the weaknesses of our system. So
the rise in power of MBDA would be an element that would allow to
increase in volume, because when you know there's a nearly infinite stock of ammunition that you can deplete, it's very tempting to go buy the boat that fires this ammunition. That's also why people buy American, because you're buying the F-35. In open source data, there are over 20,000 advanced medium-range air-to-air missile, long-range air-to-air missiles in stock. So you can think that the day when you will need them, provided that Washington agrees, of course, they will supply them to you. They can go deplete from their stock. So if you don't have enough, the Meteors are open source. It is said that there are roughly between 3,500 and 4,000. That's not bad, but if we had 15,000, it would be better. So we have quite a few platforms to promote. And above all, what I see is a very credible risk of conflicts in the Indo-Pacific. And that, if we go back, means a generalized rearmament. If it's in 10 years, the platforms we know now won't exist, 36,000. Developing a good fighter plane, developing a refueling aircraft, developing a submarine, it takes years, even decades. So, in fact, we need to mass produce the systems that already exist today. So,
the choices that France has made for years to continue to invest in the development of technologies that allow us to say now we can industrialize it. It's a real competitive advantage over other countries like Germany, who have somewhat abandoned research as well. Yes?
But even England, because England, in fact, they have a strategy, especially for the F-35, which consisted of saying we do a small part of the F-35 program, and like that, we will have F-35. But then the day when the Americans say, in fact, I want all my F-35 for myself, and well, we're going to leave you a few, but really just a few. They have nothing left to offer. So yes, it's the strategy that consisted of saying we do eat our free. That is, we can do without the American industry today. It's a huge capital, and I think it's a capital that needs to be monetized. And to monetize it, it's not just products. It's not like going to the supermarket and buying a bottle of Coke. It's really, you have to come up with a credible scenario. I think everyone understands the danger and the solutions we can bring and the advantage of not being dependent on Washington. It's not just because we dislike Americans, but due to their behavior. When conflict arises, they will prioritize their own needs and consider themselves the priority. And everything else, it will come second, and that's normal. And we would do the same in the same situation from...
Anyway, sovereignty is a wish, is a goal that must be on the agenda of all politicians. And
besides, it allows to sell. So, incidentally, Nicolas,
a big thank you.
exactly.
We put all the elements back to go see your information, your YouTube channel, etc. We'll reach out to you soon for other economically focused analyses, even
if we
would be better with peace, even eternal peace. We would be...
Peace is preferable, but like insurance policies, considering the worst is necessary to make the right choices. Today, it's...
the final word. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you very soon at the Air and Cosmos studio. Cosmos.